Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming in. Yeah, it's working. Look at that, the wonders of technology. Thank you, Nick. Nick is one of our marketing experts, and he's spent a lot of time preparing this conference, inviting all of you, and making sure that we're actually on time and delivering. Let's see if it works out as planned. Welcome to Reshaping Behavioral Health at the Workplace. And I think before we discuss what this means and what the hell are we actually talking about, we should probably talk about a little bit about the US healthcare system. If you look at the top left part of this very strange slide, you can see an OECD report that basically compares the expenditure per capita on healthcare versus the quality as measured by life expectancy. You can very clearly see, if you get a little closer to the screen, I guess, that we're spending 2.5 times the average of the OECD per capita, while getting around 70 or 75% of the quality of the life expectancy. There are many ways to look at this slide. There are many variants on this research, but in all of them, the bottom line basically means that we have the most expensive and the least efficient healthcare delivery system in the world. Number one, America first. Now, actually, in many ways, this is the good picture, because this chart describes the entire healthcare system, while if you deep dive into behavioral health, it's actually much worse. This is the picture that we saw, Ronnie and myself, in 2012 when we started Talkspace, which is a complete, and I would say, I'm using the word disgrace, and I actually think this is an understatement. It's a broken, underserved market that is really, really in many ways shameful. The timing now is slightly different, and I have to tell you that I am personally very encouraged by the way attitudes toward behavioral health and mental health care have changed in the last few years. I trace this in my memory, in my experience, to one of the most horrific incidents, I think, in memory, at least in my memory, which is Newtown. And I think, in my sense, in my gut, something changed about the public debate, public discussion, the media ethnology almost around behavioral health since that horrific event. And I think today, and if you look on the right side of this messy slide, you see some reminders and some data and quotes basically saying that I think people are beginning to understand the size, the incredible scale of the issue, which is the broken delivery system of behavioral health. It is expressed and it's being measured in incredible human suffering and pain to begin with, but also in huge damages to the economy. The numbers currently put depression as a cost to the United States economy anywhere between $300 billion and $500 billion a year. The WHO numbers put depression as the #1 disease of the Western world in terms of cost and prevalence, well ahead of heart diseases or cancers or diabetes or any other phenomena that we all suffer from eventually. And I think, it has come to a point in time where the debate deserves this kind of getting together and sorting out and looking for ways to change things in a very fundamental and a very effective way. Because the one thing I think we can clearly agree upon when looking at the data, this is not personal, this is not judgmental, the data very clearly shows that the current system has failed big time. When you look at the real life, 1 in every 4 Americans, so between 25 and 20%, will suffer from a diagnosable mental health issue each and every year. That's between 60 and 70 million people every year. And what does it mean, 1 in 4 Americans? It basically means us. If let's say that there are 150 people in here, then I would say that 40 of us will suffer from a diagnosable mental health issue this very year during 2017. And this repeats itself in 2018 and so on and so forth. That obviously means that it is us, it's our friends, it's our family, it's our basically employees. And I think when we look as employers at the employee landscape, this becomes very fascinating because most people that are here are very familiar with delivering behavioral health at the workplace. And I guess we could agree that the current delivery system, any combination of BH and EAP or counselors on campus, whatever solution that we came up to address this, what do you think the highest penetration rate is going to be? 5%? Anyone wants to challenge that? 3%. Yeah, that's a different kind of challenge. I accept it. So, the data that we see show that EAPs are penetrating at something between 1 and 3%, and really the best delivery systems of the best companies with the best policies and coverage reach 5%. Now, if 25% of your employees, and our employees, ourselves, will have a diagnosable mental health issue this year, and we penetrated 5%, that is a very simple translation. It means that 75% of their employees are not treated at all or undertreated. I'm not going to go into all the details because I think the vast majority of you know it, but undertreated for behavioral health employees will be absent for around a month in a year, 28 days actually. They will spend around 140% on increased medical costs because they will go elsewhere to look for help. They will suffer from much higher attrition, and I'm not even talking about productivity and morale, the culture of the organization, which has to deal with the people that are basically ill. So I think the effect or the damages to organizations that are delivering behavioral health to around a quarter of the people that really need it is something that's becoming very, I think, acknowledged. And I think this may be a little bit of a wishful thinking, but what I feel is that this is moving from, we understand the problem, we acknowledge it, we face it, to actually how do we solve it in a fundamentally and dramatically better way, which is a very important shift and a very important development that has not been around culturally at workplaces up until very recently. So that's, I think, the background to the issue that we're dealing with. It is a society-level issue. This is not something that's technical. It's not about improving the business outcomes of this business or the other business. This is something that's very fundamental to the way we are together as a society. When we, going back to Talkspace, and I'll do a little bit of selling, but don't worry, I'll do it quickly and I hope effectively. When we started Talkspace 5 years ago, we had a very simple vision, which is therapy for all. The reason we started Talkspace is because Ronnie and myself, who co-founded the company, are very big believers in the profession that's called psychotherapy. We went through it ourselves. We know it pretty well from personal experiences. And we thought that it's a shame. It's just not fair that people cannot really get it. And what we really set out to develop and find is a way for dramatically more people to be able to access therapy and say, well, you know what, at least I tried it. I went for it. I gave it a try. If it helped me, fantastically. It's a convert. We know that people who have been successful with therapy are converts. They will tell the world that this is helpful and we can spread the good news. And if not, at least you know that you tried something. And maybe you'll try it again, maybe you won't, but it's fair enough. That was our vision. And when we looked and we studied why people are not, accessing and using therapy much more than the relatively few that are actually doing it, we found I would say 3.5 entry barriers to the reasons why people are not using therapy. Number one by far is cost. Again, let's not go into too many details, but I would say that the average cost of a therapy session is somewhere between $100 to $150 a session, on average across the United States. Of course, that in Palo Alto it's going to cost a little more, or on the Upper East Side, and of course somewhere else in the country it's going to cost a little less, but that's the average. It's interesting to know that around 75 to 80% of psychotherapy is paid out of pocket. And much of the reason, there's a host of reasons why it is like that, but I'll mention that just a few of them, which is if you actually try and get reimbursed by your insurance companies, you will pay expert level fees. So $30, $40 a session can happen easily. And I think more dramatically, this is going to go directly to your deductibles, which probably means you're going to have to spend a few grand before you get reimbursed by your insurance companies. So it's not a really good solution. The second one is, let's say that we all work together and that Michael here is my boss, and we are during a workday right here in the center of San Francisco, and all of a sudden I take off and I go for, a couple of hours, probably visiting Marin County or the Presidio, where I meet my therapist for 50 minutes. It's usually during office hours. And I'm not really going to be very comfortable in telling Michael that I'm off for a couple of hours in order to see my therapist. Not because I'm really ashamed of it, because I'm projecting on Michael and thinking that he actually is going to think that maybe I'm not worthy of a promotion or a raise in our next discussion. So this is a matter, a combination of the two other subjects, which is the convenience. So getting to see a therapist, the scheduling, the finding the time, the traveling, and the stigma. And the stigma, thank you very much for asking, is extremely alive and well in 2017. I think you'll hear further on down the road today some very interesting thoughts about what is stigma, why is it still with us, and who is actually should take responsibility in order to eliminate it. And stigma is a complicated creature. Yeah, it has to do with shame, that I don't want other people to know that I suffer from a mental health issue. But it also has to do with this sense of intimidation, this sense of being judged, that is very common amongst people that are seeing a therapist face-to-face during the early days of their treatment. And as you will see in the data later, it's very, very effective in a negative way on their adherence to treatment. The last thing that is not really mentioned here is the matching with the therapist, which is extremely important. The whole thing is based on relationship and on trust. Is very anecdotal and is very hyper-local, and it's actually mostly based on referrals by friends and family and on the availability. So the level of, I would say, quality measures within a typical match is practically not existent. We'll get to it later. The first phase of Talkspace was designing a front-end or delivery system that actually removes those 3.5 entry barriers: the cost, the inconvenience, the stigma, and the quality of the match. We called it at the time unlimited messaging therapy, and what it fundamentally does is it does away with the 50-minute therapy hour and replaces it with a constant stream of communications, mostly asynchronous, between my therapist and myself. When I say asynchronous messaging, it's mostly in text, so writing to each other, but also in audio messaging, which is very popular and very effective, video messaging, and some live video and audio as well. But interestingly enough, most of our clients and the therapist patients are really only open for a live video session once the bond or the attachment has been achieved with the therapist. So you actually gain trust, and only then will you be ready to have a live video session. trust me, it took us a lot of time and money and mistakes and failures to understand that this is the modality that's beneficial and is being used and accepted by both sides, by the providers, the professional licensed therapists, and by their patients. I won't go into too many details, but this is working extremely well. How does it address the 3 barriers to entry? Well, it allows us to reduce the cost dramatically because of the units of the time, of the matching of the time of the provider and the patient are smaller and along many more hours in the day, and it's asynchronous, so each time each side responds at their convenience. It allows us to be much more efficient and reduce the prices. I guess you understand that convenience is not a big deal, and actually once I'm done here, I can leave the stage and text my therapist and tell her, listen, this has been amazing, or this has been horrible, or all of the above, and I'll get an answer probably in a couple of hours. So this becomes relevant to what I do today and what I feel and experience today, as opposed to bear it here in your memory, and let's talk about it next Wednesday at 3 p.m. Stigma is extremely interesting how it behaves in this modality, because people tend to feel, and we have very strong data around that, much safer behind their screens. So the technology that is such a separator of people in so many other applications, such as social networks, actually is used here to generate a sense of trust that allow our clients to open up and talk about the real core and deep issues far quicker than in the traditional delivery modality. And it allows them to go through treatment, which is the best solution for removing stigma. If you actually were benefited by psychotherapy, you're not stigmatized anymore, because you can feel the difference. And you're going to tell people around you that you guys are wrong. This is really helpful. And once you get rid of the stigma, you can help yourself. So that's extremely important for us. One of the biggest issues or difficulties in the traditional delivery modality that we saw that is not addressing the need is the time to service. I would say that on average across the country, and certainly here in San Francisco, if you wanted to schedule a face-to-face session with a therapist, it would probably take you between 2 and 3 weeks, which sometimes, it depends on the level of the pain, the level of the intent, and the level of the needs, is just not good enough. And we all know what happens. So yeah, you know what, I'm going to go and see a therapist and deal with it, and then you make a few phone calls, you find someone, they say next Wednesday at 4 p.m., but you're actually on a business trip or you have something else and they don't have any other availability, and then you settle for Tuesday in 2 weeks' time. By the time this has arrived, around a third of the people don't even make it to the first meeting, to the first session. Because life takes over, because you will have intellectualized your issue, because you would have found a different spouse, or, moved on, or usually tell yourself, you know what, it's going to go away. Or you went to your general practitioner and asked for a nice medication, probably an SSRI, and deal with it that way, which we all know is not enough. It's helpful, it's needed, but it's not enough. So the time to service is a critical issue that we addressed by working by design in 2 layers. We have an amazing group of people called the matching therapists. They are all licensed professional therapists that are available 24/7, and they will take your issue in under 2 minutes. They will do a professional intake. They will understand whether you're a good fit for psychotherapy and for our platform. They will offer you a plan to start your treatment, and they will do a qualitative match, not an anecdotal match, according to your assumed condition and your history. And as I said before, your first interaction with the therapist will happen in under 2 minutes, and around 80% of the people will be matched with their primary therapist, the therapist that will do the treatment with them in their own state on the same day, typically few hours away. So I have a pain, I have decided to pursue this. In 2 minutes, I will talk to a therapist. I will choose with this therapist my primary therapist. This is how it looks like. And in a few hours, 80% of the time, in the same day, I will begin treatment. This is dramatically different, and as you'll see later, it has a dramatic effect on the results. The way we do the match is we actually have enough information about how well our therapists are performing per condition, and we manage for quality, which I'll show you in a few slides. So if I was diagnosed by my matching therapist as suffering from anxiety, the persons that will be offered to me will be the highest available scoring clinical efficacy anxiety therapist that the system can provide. And there will be usually, certainly in California, which is a large state, multiple choices. If you can see the little details, we can actually tell you when we expect this therapist to get in touch with you. So you can consider it once you read their CV, their history, their experience, other clients' reviews, and how they speak about themselves. You can include that in your decision-making process and say, well, I think I'm going to wait for this particular person, which feels very right to me. It's worth waiting 10 hours, despite the fact that someone else is available in a couple of hours. So we involve the clients, their patients, the therapist patients in the decision-making process. It helps a lot in generating a good relationship. And to be honest, it's really helpful for the therapist as well, because they have a sense of being picked. Someone chose me, as opposed to it's just the algorithm that says, well, you're the best fit for this particular future client. And this is working extremely effectively. And again, in terms of delivery results, the same day you're going to start your treatment. Going back to the price discussion, compared with the $100 to $150, this delivery modality allows us to offer significantly lower prices. As you can see in the middle tier, the most used plan is costing $39 a week, $40 a week, compared with $100 to $150 for a weekly session. So this becomes something that people can pay much more easily out of pocket. It's much more affordable. They can start, they can stop, they can freeze, they can return to therapy. It's extremely flexible and convenient in any aspect of using it. And it is the lowest price, and that's the way we look at it, that we can afford to offer, so people have the most access while keeping the therapist properly compensated, bless you. And you know, keeping this equation of we need to pay the therapist for the time, and they need to be happy, because they're our clients and our friends and the ones we adore, but we want to keep the price to the end consumer as low as we can. So that was the what we call the front end, which is this modality that allows us to dramatically change the proportions of the cost, the accessibility, or the convenience, and help remove a huge part of the stigma and match better. But this is, you know, I would say the tip of the iceberg of the Talkspace platform, and the real meat, if you will, the real business is behind the scenes, and it's called the Backend. And the purpose of the Backend that we build is to make sure that we deliver quality care, evidence-based care at scale. Because, you know, I'd like to be just a little controversial here and say that because I'm not a therapist, and I'm not a trained clinician, I actually have a slightly more fresh, a different point of view. I didn't grow up with this profession. I'm just an outside admirer. And I think that this profession has suffered and enjoyed, I acknowledge that as well, from I would say not a very diligent level of managing the quality outcomes over, I would say, the last quite decades. It is, again, I'm treading very carefully here, but as one dear friend has said, it is usually managed by complaints. So if someone screws up, we have a look at whether this therapist was right, whether this client is wrong. And I think in many ways, it is not really structured as a process that is measurable and therefore manageable and repeatable, which is very basic management technique and approach to many other professions, including in healthcare, most other professions. And let's say that psychotherapy is a little late to this particular show. And that is something that we set out to improve while using this extremely weird chart. What you see here is a brief description of the logic that we built in order to ascertain and manage quality at scale. At the very bottom, what you see is the structured treatment model that we created, which I would say roughly would be described as a timeline from intake through pre-treatment, through the treatment cycles, during which we also measure the outcomes. I'll talk about it in a second, all the way to completion and termination. And at the other quadrants of this slide, you see the basic ingredients. One is the quality of the network, of the Talkspace network, which is made out of who the therapists that are invited and being allowed to work with us. And there's a very rigorous vetting process to make sure that they are who they claim they are, that they are really clinically extremely well trained, that they understand the benefits and the difficulties of working in a modality that's different from what they studied at school. I'm not saying it's better or worse, but it's fundamentally different, and you need to understand the pros and the cons. The other, just the opposite side, on the left side of the screen, you will see how we measure for clinical efficacy. And we're using the very common and very fundamental industry scales, outcome measures. So if I was diagnosed with anxiety, I'll get the GAD-7, and with depression, I'll get one of the PHQs, and so on and so forth. But differently from brick and mortar therapy, what we do is we apply it to everyone from day one. So this is not small retrospective samples in order to validate what's going on, but every client that joins the system gets their scales at the very beginning of treatment once they have been diagnosed, and gets it repeatedly in intervals of 21 days. Because this is a pure digital solution, which means that every interaction in the system is on the platform is actually a line in our database, we are, for the very first time in the history of this profession, have full data visibility into what works and what doesn't work. And we use it to inform both our matching algorithms. So let's say if Nick is a therapist on the platform, and he continuously scores extremely well on the GAD-7s, he will be promoted inside our algorithm to be preferred in matching for future anxiety diagnosed clients. And on the other side, if he is extremely bad at treating anxiety, we will refer him to a subject matter expert that will help him get improved. We will give him content and opportunity to improve his outcomes in treating anxiety. And to be very candid, if he doesn't improve, he's going to be asked to leave the system. But we do have a continuous live view into Nick's performance as per the conditions, and therefore we have a full view into how every client is improving or not, and how the system is doing with regards to each condition. So in general, how well are we treating PTSD or OCD or anxiety, and so on and so forth. We use this to inform the therapist along this structured timeline of their treatment, and give them insights and feedbacks that I think dramatically improves their understanding on how their treatment is going. I've used this metaphor before, so sorry for repeating, but I've actually been wearing glasses since I was around 4 years old. And if I take them off, this becomes a very nice blur. And I think for the platform vision of the backend of Talkspace, we want to create the perfect sense of lenses for therapists that are using this platform. They will be able to see better detail farther away and understand what they see in a much better way, because we know how to leverage the data and feed it back to them so they can learn and improve, and they can be the best therapists that are capable of being while using the set of tools that we're building for them. This is very, very shortly the nature of the backend, the operating system for the profession of psychotherapy that we have built with and for the therapists that are using Talkspace in order to help them be much better at what they do and also much more consistent. If you fly a 747 out of SFO somewhere, you're not expected to remember all the checklists you need to make sure that are okay before you take off. There's a manual, there's a structure, there's a process. This is a safety net for that particular pilot, despite him having 15,000 hours of flying jets. He would never dream about, well, I'll just memorize it and do it because this is going to end up in tears. This is another sort of metaphor for our operating system in which we remind the therapist of the very basics, which some of them may forget, not because they don't care, God forbid, or because they're negligent, because it's very difficult to remember everything. But if we created an operating system that actually suggests and reminds and helps contextualize and provide relevant content for each stage of therapy, and it's absolutely up to the therapist whether to use it and learn from it, which fundamentally all of them do, because why wouldn't you? It's a tool there for you. We think it's a huge help. I'll go very quickly because I think I'm getting a little low on time. This is a full back end for the therapist to manage their clinic. It's a fully integrated solution. They have a dashboard telling them exactly what the situation and the condition of each of their client is, and they can swipe and see all the information that I manage and much more than that, move between video and text. They can see the structure of the therapy that I mentioned. Again, if you guys want some more details, we can do it offline. And we contextualize all the content and reminders to the point in time where they are in treatment. And last but not least, they can see how well their clients are doing in terms of clinical efficacy. Is it significant? Is it not significant? Is it improving? Is it not improving? And what we see in our backend, this is just an sample chart that shows us what are the percentages of clients per therapist that show significant clinical improvement. As you can see, the top one is around 80%, so 80% of these therapist clients are showing significant clinical improvement as defined by the outcome measures that we're using, not by ourselves. And therefore, we can better understand which are the therapists that are delivering better than others, help the others improve in their particular fields, and manage the entire network for quality in a way that has not been possible, available, or doable in any other delivery model. That's the real essence of the Talkspace backend. I'll go very quickly and tell you that since we are a new model and there is resistance, and some people are saying, guys, this is, I would put it like that. Every psychoanalyst above the age of 60 thinks that this is blasphemy. That's a clear cutoff line, And we're listening to that, and we understand that this generates some resistance, and that not all people are created equal in their openness to change, and also that we need and we should tread very carefully and stay on extremely solid ground in terms of our clinical delivery, because do no harm, do no harm, do no harm. So we are extra, I would say, careful to validate everything that we do in clinical research. And I'll give you just a short list of what we're doing. So actually, I'm very happy to announce that we have concluded a large scale of roughly 300 a patient sample with Columbia, with Professor Barry Farber, who leads clinical psychology at Teachers College, and his colleague Dr. George Nitzberg. And it's concluded and submitted to a very good journal, a Journal of Psychotherapy. We know the results, and I can give you just a few bits and pieces from it. So one thing that's really, really interesting, and we see it across our audience, that 50% of the people that were researched there never had any access to psychotherapy or any kind of behavioral health help before. And that applies to our entire audience, which is extremely and especially heartwarming for us, because it basically shows that we are successful in removing the entry barriers. So those are people that they will testify that they could not access traditional therapy before, and Talkspace removed those access barriers to them. Somewhat logically, they suffer from very high acuities, around 20% higher than expected in their condition, compared with the scale and the standards of traditional therapy. And to get to the bottom lines, this was done using the OQ45, again, very common for clinical outcomes. And you expect a decrease or a change, a delta of 14 points in clinical outcomes on this scale to show something that's clinically significant. On average, we doubled it. There'll be much more details into it, of course, in the full report per condition. We measured multiple conditions, multiple counts of clients, and there's a lot of detail into it. But as you can see, it basically suggests that we are extremely effective. And this has been validated and supporting previous research that we did that was actually published in the Journal of Telemedicine and eHealth that shows that the clinical efficacy of the Talkspace platform is extremely similar, I would say equals or sometimes a tiny bit better than the baseline of traditional therapy. But the cost and the time to efficacy is around 30 to 40%. So this has been published as well. Be happy to share with anyone that's interested in reading it. And there are a couple of other researches that have been submitted, and you can get them in the form of white papers that deal specifically with employee depression, which is kind of relevant for what we're talking about today. And we did an extremely large-scale study of more than 5,000 clients, because we have this data, as I mentioned before, on multiple conditions. You can have access to that. I don't think there has been this size of a research for decades now in psychotherapy. And we have done our own research on PTSD. We have a lot of veterans that suffer from PTSD as clients, and we are very focused on helping them. This is why there's an ongoing research, which is an external research, not our own, with Duke University, with Patty Razik, who is world famous in treating PTSD. It's ongoing, and it's an RCT. It's a very interesting research that will be concluded this year. I'm also very happy to announce something more recent, which we have signed an RCT with Yale. RCT is or random control trial is the holy grail. It's much more complicated. Personally, I think we have all the data in the world and we don't really need it, but because I think we should be extremely careful and solid, we are investing the time and the money in doing a proper RCT with Yale, and it's due to begin on June 1st. And last but not least, we're working with a neighbor, Stanford, on something that is extremely fascinating and interesting for me as someone who would like to think of themselves as driven by data in making decisions. The head of the NLP lab in Stanford is Professor Leskovich, and his team are working on analyzing the qualitative aspects of language, because come to think of it, when I go and see a face-to-face therapist for 50 minutes, there's a lot of source code that's changing hands. It's called language, what we speak to each other. But at the end of each session, that thing has been erased and gone. And my therapist will probably write a description of their very subjective opinion of what happened during the session, and it will be a massively reduced version of the data that actually changed hands during the session. No one had access to that black box before, which is what really is the code, the data, the language that's in the therapy room. But today we have it, and we already learned fascinating things about the usage of sentiment and different kinds of language patterns as it is connected to efficacy. We're not doing that out of curiosity. We're doing that in order to offer more tools to our therapists in order to be more effective and more helpful in what they deliver. So this is fascinating. We already have some early results from this, and I do hope that in 3 to 4 months this will be a massively interesting paper that will be published. At the end of the day, and this is data from multiple sources, what's really happening and why the system is not functioning as it should be, as you can see on the right column, is that out of every 100 people that set up a first meeting with a face-to-face therapist, only 22%, so 22 out of 100, make it to clinical significant effect. Why? Because of all the things we discussed, because some of them won't make it to the first meeting, and some of them will go to the first meeting and say, well, you know, this has been such a schlep, and I'm not going up to Marin County again, and I don't know if this guy is actually capable of helping me, and they're not making it to the second session, and so on and so forth. So the access and the cost and the stigma and the fact that much of the traditional delivery modality is not really measured and managed for quality leads to I would say, reaching efficacy. And this is not about surviving 3 months, make no mistakes. This is surviving the minimal time in order to get a clinically significant reduction in symptoms. That's 22%. We tripled that. It's not because we're smarter or have better intents or we care more. I don't think so. I think we care. I think we're doing as much as we can. But I think we just took a completely different approach, a fresh look on a delivery system that has not been good enough, and we see it by the outcomes. So for us, this is the fact that we can get 60 people out of 100 that come through our gates to something that's significantly and clearly and demonstratingly helpful for them is the huge achievement that we planned for. And I think by using more data and more learnings and better tools for therapists, we can actually improve on that as well. That is what I have to tell you guys, and thank you again for coming in today, and I hope you'll enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you.